After a long time, the carriage arrived at the fortress. The man inside asked to open the gates since he brought her. The protagonist looked out the window, and in her bright, pink eyes, amazement appeared, and surprise upon seeing the gigantic fortress. Immediately, they opened the gates of the Phoenix Duchy fortress for them. She had been told that in the north, winter always reigns. But inside the castle, despite the intense cold, it was surprisingly green. And Yuna was even amazed by the capacity of the magic stones. Her uncle informed her that this was now her new home. From that day on, she was the archbishop's wife. As soon as Yuna stepped out of the carriage, the maids receiving her started whispering amongst themselves without disguising it. The uncle's hand rested on his niece's shoulder. He explained that northerners tend to be cold towards outsiders. On Rook Island, where the protagonist originated, the concept of a nation did not exist. But for her tribe, the young woman was willing to do anything. She took off her hood and introduced herself smiling. The maids were instantly surprised by her angelic beauty. Suddenly, a male voice very close by asked if she was his wife, and everyone got flustered upon seeing His Highness. Lord Theo of Phoenix, bloodstained, explained that he had just returned from a hunt. He extended his bloodied hand towards the young woman. As soon as she was introduced, the protagonist greeted him shyly, with a surprisingly warm handshake. And firm. However, his voice was quite cold. Juno paid it no mind. Suddenly, the Lord announced there would be no formal wedding ceremony, which surprised the protagonist. Theo revealed that he had already been married 3 times, and his previous wives were missing. Or dead. A little later, the Lord's secretary showed her where she would live. The chambers were separate from Theo, and Jules asked her to take it as an opportunity to gradually get used to the place. Only her room was on the tower roof, and all other floors were empty. The protagonist was both surprised and excited, unable to believe she would live there completely alone. Lord Phoenix was drinking in his study. Drill arrived and reported that he had settled the girl in the North Tower. However, Drill was very intrigued to know why the Lord was covered in blood, when in reality there had been no hunt whatsoever. Theo explained that it was like a warning. He made her understand that there was no marital harmony. Now she would surely remain quiet as a mouse and not show herself from her dusty attic. And upon hearing this, Yuli's decided to call David. With a smile, the Lord asked if she had cried upon learning about the attic. But the counselors reported that she had smiled. Theo's eyes immediately widened, and he stopped drinking, as this was not what he expected to hear from Julie's. The protagonist was delighted. She was happy with so much personal space. Furthermore, thanks to the magic stones, the room was quite warm, and the young woman even warmed her frozen hands for a few minutes. She hoped that now her people could also live in warmth. The beauty recalled the old times. Her father exclaimed indignantly that she couldn't marry a man she had never seen in her life. However, it was colder on the island, and her people had never known winter before. Therefore, the young woman had already decided everything. Eternal spring reigned in Ruxay. But when the intense cold suddenly struck the island, its inhabitants panicked. Until now, there had been no need for magic crystals. The emperor's proposal to marry the archduke, in exchange for obtaining a large amount of magic crystals, became the last hope for the inhabitants of Rouge. But her father insisted on his stance, as Yuna was his only heir. The heroine considered protecting her people to be the primary task of an heiress. Every time the protagonist reminded herself that she would manage to overcome it, she constantly remembered that her uncle Delkin was on her side. And besides, the Lord's secretary Ellis had seemed kind to her. Suddenly, the heroine remembered the Archduke's hands. In Rook, hunters were the most respected caste. Furthermore, the protagonist was set to spend an entire year in the attic. But Yuna was even happy, as it was a good opportunity to get to know her husband. She had a feeling they would get along well. The young woman was so happy that she accidentally touched the magic crystal. Immediately they started falling, and the young woman instantly got scared, trying to catch them so they wouldn't break when hitting the floor. However, she exaggerated a little. The girl accidentally fell onto the door, which immediately opened. The protagonist fell to the floor and realized it was probably a secret passage she hadn't noticed right away. It hurt a little to fall. Suddenly, a voice asked her what she was doing there. The protagonist was surprised to see her husband standing in front of her, already impeccably dressed. And looking at her with astonishment, Theo lost the ability to speak for a few seconds. Yuna tried to explain that she was just trying to catch a stone, but the man didn't understand at all what was happening with this girl, since at that moment she should be sitting in the attic crying. But instead, she decided to introduce herself again. The protagonist expressed that she really hoped they would get along. For some reason, the Archduke seemed to see his new wife's face in a completely new light. And he couldn't even look away from her. He didn't understand why he hadn't observed her properly during their first meeting. But he immediately perceived that floral scent. Theo supposed it might be the perfume of that beautiful young woman and started observing her closely at that very moment. She was petite and elegant. Her eyelashes were like bird feathers. Her eyes were like two precious stones, and only then did Theo realize he was thinking something strange at that moment. He mentally ordered himself to regain control. Theo must feel nothing for her because weakness was inadmissible. Therefore, he could not fall in love with this girl. He needed to be even colder and rougher. He decided to yell at her and throw her back into the attic. He intended to act this way, but seeing that Yuna was shivering from the cold, he instantly forgot all his words. Instead, Theo asked why she was so thinly dressed. He instantly understood his mistake. Daphne's goddess messenger was the only soul on the planet worthy of her powerful sacred strength. But in reality, it was nothing more than an invention. Or rather, that's what everyone believed until a method was found to steal her strength. 2 months ago, the Archduke of Phoenix asked his faithful counselor if the letter had indeed reached him by chance. It mentioned the saint with a red mark who could be sacrificed in a year. To seize the saint's strength, one must possess the mark. Theo was the only one in the imperial family who had not yet received the mark. For members of the imperial family, marriage was a sacred alliance of souls. And the mark a man received was unique, and exactly 1 year after the wedding. The mark remained for life, which meant one had to choose their partner seriously. However, each of the Lord's previous companions had either fled or died. The third candidate for the Archduke's wife was successfully eliminated, and now preparations to receive the mark were finally complete. If more is needed, the Emperor eliminated them all. The Archduke was the Emperor Bai's nephew on his mother's side. He was nicknamed the Demon of War and the Beast who went mad on the battlefield, causing genuine terror in everyone around him. At the age of 15, Theo lost his mother and entered a battlefield for the first time. Since then, fear became an inadmissible luxury for him. If he showed weakness even for a moment, he would fall, and with him, the North would fall. And all its inhabitants. In a shared grave with enemies, Theo buried his emotions. However, this resulted in his own subjects starting to avoid him. Each of the man's wives either fled, taking a mortal risk to avoid living with a monster, or ended up in the other world. But nonetheless, Theo felt no sadness. He simply let time flow, and days turn into years. The counselor reported that they needed a plan urgently, because the emperor could not be allowed to do as he pleased. Therefore, Theo simply decided to marry her. Julie got angry and asked how he was going to marry a woman they would sacrifice in a year. Theo coldly replied that the emperor would not dare touch her, but he needed to get the mark with her. The Archduke was very interested to know what the great emperor would say if the mark appeared. And now he stood before his new wife. Theo prepared again to truly scare her. But suddenly, the young woman innocently asked His Highness if he wasn't cold himself. The Lord coldly replied that he did not feel the cold. However, joy suddenly appeared on Juna's face. She averted her gaze shyly, realizing that His Highness's attire was quite revealing. And Theo did not understand her behavior. But soon he understood that his plan had worked. Theo explained that if they crossed the bridge, they would reach his private terrace. If she suddenly wants to go somewhere, she must come to him, as she was not permitted to move without his authorization. Moreover, Theo decided to scare her. In a serious tone, he told her that he was even capable of catching a bright white squirrel. The protagonist was surprised to learn that only a few steps separated the attic from His Highness's chambers. Suddenly, a strong wind blew. Suddenly, Yuna began to lose her balance. The man's hand instinctively reached forward. In the next instant, the protagonist was very close to her husband, and her face flushed intensely from this proximity. She remained motionless watching him. A slight blush also appeared on Theo's face. To the girl, she seemed weightless, as if light as a feather. And her figure resembled an elegant profile. She looked like a small bird in his hands. Yuna called him softly. The Archduke quickly withdrew his hand from the young woman and supposed that she disliked his touch. His previous wives were bothered by even the lightest touches, but surprisingly, Yuna was grateful. To the former wives, his subjects, and enemy soldiers, the Northern Archbishop always was, and will be nothing more than incarnate horror. But in Juna's eyes, there was not a trace of fear. Theo suddenly wondered if it made sense to keep trying to intimidate her. Moreover, Theo could give this beautiful woman whatever she desired, so if he offered her something valuable, Juna couldn't escape. He asked the protagonist if she needed magic stones. Juna understood that the Archbishop knew why she had married him. However, Theo probably wouldn't like it if the protagonist reminded him now that this marriage was purely strategic. Therefore, Juna replied that she didn't need him to give them right away. Theo was surprised, but asked what she really wanted. He immediately noticed that the young woman's face changed, and she started thinking about something after his words. It was unknown what phrase would next come from her lips. Perhaps now she would ask him to let her return home. However, whatever the girl said at that moment, she would surely face disappointment, because Theo had no intention of letting her go anywhere. Yuna suggested having breakfast together, but he rejected the idea without realizing it. As soon as Theo understood the meaning of her words, he asked what she had just said. The protagonist, with a wide and sincere smile on her face, proposed again to His Highness to have breakfast together. She didn't ask for stones or money. It was just a shared breakfast. However, Theo didn't understand what such a small squirrel could eat for breakfast. So he considered going to the forest to look for acorns. Suddenly, Yuna started apologizing for it. The Archduke remained silent for a long time, so the protagonist acted like that. She was just hoping for a light conversation during breakfast to get to know each other better. And suddenly, Theo accepted. However, he expressed that it would be better to have lunch. The counselor was displeased about being woken up so early. He didn't understand why His Highness was rushing to replace the kitchen chef right at dawn. Therefore, Julies assumed it was because of the Archduchess. Theo remembered that Yuna now held the position of his wife, so it was essential for them to share a table sometimes. Julies suspected that the Lord had become interested in that young woman. Perhaps the Lord would now resume a normal life. The counselor decided to help, and suggested to His Highness sending Count Del Khan to the northern wall to solve the refugee problem. That will take exactly 3 months. That means Yuna will have no contact with him during this whole time. The protagonist was very surprised to learn from her uncle that, by order of her husband, she had to travel to the northern wall. Before leaving, Del Khan wanted to discuss something. He asked his niece if they had consummated the marriage yet. The uncle clarified that he meant if she had spent the night with the Archduke, and the protagonist instantly blushed. Delkin was angry to learn that nothing had happened yet. With that face, she should have convinced him to sleep with her a long time ago. He should have guided his niece, but instead, the man was forced to go to the northern wall because of some refugees. So he told Yuna that her husband didn't like it if they hadn't consummated the marriage yet. She should seduce him immediately. Delkin suggested his niece wear something provocative so that any man would immediately desire to take it off. Suddenly, a sound was heard. Yuna wondered what that was. The uncle told her to remember his advice. And after saying she understood, the protagonist went out onto the main terrace. A voice beside her warned that she would freeze soon. The Archduke threw his jacket over the heroine. He explained to the young woman that if she caught a cold, an additional problem would arise, and therefore, it should be avoided. Yuna blushed and thanked the man, but the jacket was big, so Tio decided to cut the sleeves off with his sword. The protagonist immediately replied that she would simply roll up the sleeves and everything would be fine, since a good garment should not be ruined. Tio held back a smile and asked if she had seen Delcan. Yuna nodded and told him she was leaving for business, but Tio actually knew everything they had discussed, since it could be heard perfectly from the hallway. He had listened to the entire conversation without attracting attention. If Delcan wasn't around, Tio told her, she could approach him with any question. But for some reason, the girl blushed. Delcan explained to her that she just had to please him, and the magic crystals would flow into her hands like a river. Suddenly, Yuna's stomach roared loudly. The protagonist instantly started apologizing. She usually had breakfast every day. But today she couldn't and hadn't eaten since the day before. Theo's face immediately reddened. This girl was too cute. After a while, the Northern Duke was already in his study, surrounded by imaginary birds, and thinking about something. His subordinates didn't understand why he was admiring his fingers. Theo's personal physical therapist, David, was excited because the Lord had called him on his own for the first time. He used to work as a field doctor. There, the hero verified that emotional wounds are much harder to heal than physical ones. His Highness's wounds turned out to be serious, as the Lord was indifferent to everything, as if he had no emotions. So surely something was serious now. David asked about the severity of the symptoms, and Tio replied that they were serious. The personal physical therapist's eyes shone, and he asked His Highness to describe his current state in more detail. In a confident tone, Tio reported that he had been cursed. Confusion appeared on the subordinates' faces. They didn't understand who dared to curse the Duke himself, and the dark-haired man explained that he was about to tame someone. Theo explained that it was a long-tailed bluefinch. It was very small and adorable. However, the powerful Northern Archduke was completely sure that this small and fragile finch had managed to bewitch him somehow. David asked what made him suspect a spell. Tio hit the table and exclaimed that he always wanted to see her. It drove him crazy to put her in his pocket and always carry her with him to admire her celestial beauty at all times. Silence fell in the room. David did not expect to hear a story about the finch, but it is worth noting that His Excellency, for the first time in a long time, he began to show emotions, which indicated that there were improvements. David firmly exclaimed that they had indeed cast a spell on him. Under normal circumstances, he would have prescribed a special magical antidote that would remove all magical effects. But first, the finch must be shown to someone else. If the finch is enchanted, the magic of the spell will also affect others. If the Archduke himself understands that the emotion is not caused by magic, it will be easier for him to accept the change in his character. Theo told David that this was his first and most useful recommendation. The physical therapist was pleased to receive a compliment directed at him. He left the room, and then the advisor asked his lord if he really believed Yuna used magic. Then Yuli's would also have shown symptoms. But they will discover the truth when they use David's advice. The day of the hunt was approaching, and all the gathered aristocrats would gather in one place, where they could present His Highness, the Northern Archduchess. Yuli's was tasked with preparing everything. Theo also asked him to ensure Yuna was warmly dressed. The advisor, for some reason, felt uneasy and replied to his lord that he would take care of it. A few days later, Yuli's went out with Yuna onto the street. He immediately noticed that the girl's hands were red and offered her some gloves. They were almost reaching the hunting grounds, where the aristocrats would gather every month to meet the Archduke. Today was the first gathering. Yuna did not yet know the local protocol rules well. The advisor explained that the river was not yet completely frozen, and that, when it was, they could skate on it. But Yuna didn't know what that was, and Yuli's promised to get her a pair specifically. They approached the cabin, and the counselor opened the door for the girl. Inside, Yuna immediately noticed several men. One of them quickly approached her and exclaimed enthusiastically that she was truly beautiful, and that the servants hadn't lied about it. The Archduke was probably very pleased. Julies asked them to remember good manners, but they didn't understand what they had said wrong, since the girl was really beautiful. So their words were not inappropriate in any way. They knew she had been sold in exchange for magic stones. That's why they started offering the girl magic stones. The protagonist clenched her fist, because now those words directed at her felt awkward. Julies angrily asked what the hell they were saying. The Archduke coldly asked what they were plotting there. The aristocrats were startled to see the angry face of the Northern Archduke on the second floor, and they asked how long he had been there. Theo ordered Julies to take the girl to the second floor. An aristocrat, in a hesitant voice, suggested to His Highness that he leave the hunt. But the Archduke coldly announced that it was cancelled. Then he roughly grabbed him by the neck and lifted him with one hand. Theo promised him he wouldn't get away clean. The Archbishop forcefully grabbed the aristocrat's hand and asked if he had perhaps accumulated so many magic crystals. Did he perhaps have more than the Northern Archbishop? Then he threw him to the floor. Theo coldly ordered them to listen carefully now. Now they must leave quietly and be gone, but if they sacrificed the crystals hidden from the Empire, they would keep their limbs. The Archbishop requested that word be sent that if anyone sullied the Archbishop's honor, they would instantly lose their life. The aristocrats immediately fled in panic. The protagonist was sitting on the sofa, waiting for her husband. She had never been so humiliated before. Suddenly, the young woman heard a noise downstairs and started worrying that the Archbishop had run into trouble because of her. However, the man immediately opened the door. Yuna was surprised to see him. He saw how the other aristocrats actually treated her, so Theo no longer considered her suitable to be his wife. The man knelt before the young woman and asked her to give him her hand. Bewilderment appeared on Yuna's face. The Archduke immediately explained that he thought the young woman had a wound on her hand. And Yuna looked at her arm in surprise. Indeed, her hand had reddish nail marks. Theo applied a healing stone ointment, and everything healed quickly. He asked with concern if it hurt a lot. Instead of answering his question, the Archduke heard apologies from his wife for having offended him because of her. Important figures attended this hunt, and maintaining good relations with them was crucial. That's why the protagonist was very distressed. But Theo asked her to remember that in these lands, only he was superior to the Archduchess. In his lands, he could do whatever he wanted. Theo was the master of these lands, and she was his lady. The protagonist reflected on her husband's words. He was right, since she really had nothing to fear due to her rank as Northern Archduchess. But her concerns persisted. His Highness was her husband. She withdrew her hand, as it was uncomfortable for her to think about it. From the girl's reaction, the man deduced that the idea of having to stay there forever was probably tormenting her. Yuna asked if he was going home right now. She took off her cloak and explained that Julies had prepared a house dress for her. Theo stood motionless, unable to say anything. That beautiful dress had been made especially for today, so it would be a shame not to wear it as intended. Until then, he had only seen her in loose dresses. At that moment, Theo found her so light. The Archduke slapped his face instantly, realizing what he had just thought. And he mentally ordered himself to calm down immediately. Yuna asked if she looked that strange. Theo refuted her assumptions and asked if she had ever been married. The girl nodded and enthusiastically told him that she even knew how to use a crossbow, although she had never managed to hunt anything. She herself was like an adorable little animal. Theo extended his hand and suggested they take a walk in the forest. The protagonist took his hand and with a warm smile replied to the Archduke that it was a wonderful idea. So that's what our protagonists did. There were many flowers, but they gave off absolutely no scent. That's because they were cultivated using magic stones. Therefore, the flowers were artificial and had no scent. Yuna suggested going in another direction. The scent of her hair seemed pleasant to our protagonist, while the young woman enthusiastically observed other flowers. Theo was surprised, thinking it was even good that the flowers had no smell. Spell or not, it didn't matter. The Archduchess was simply beautiful, nothing more. Suddenly, the young woman informed His Highness that they could try skating here, although she didn't know what that was. Theo explained that they were boots with blades attached to them. But he was worried about the severe weather, which Yuna was not used to. The protagonist, with an enthusiastic smile, asked if he would teach her to skate and to ride sleds when possible. If she wanted to, he of course would. Suddenly, Theo noticed her red hands. He mentally scolded himself because he should have brought at least a jacket for the young woman. And something warm. Yuna took gloves out of her pocket and explained that Julie's had given them to her. They were big, but at least they kept her hands very warm. Then, the protagonist started recounting how kind Julie's was to her, and also how attentive he turned out to be. Theo frowned immediately. Was this the same Julie's who expelled more than one lord from the council? That man was willing to resort to the most cunning and dirty methods to win the war. Stopping at nothing, Julie's insisted on his observations to Theo. And for some reason, Yuna considered him kind and attentive. Julie's immediately felt a chill down his neck, making him tremble from head to toe. And it gave him an unsettling feeling. But he supposed it was just a draft. Theo understood that all of this was because of the gift. The protagonist also decided to give her something so that she would consider him kind and attentive, but everything seemed inadequate. The man kept turning over what to give her. He surely had something suitable. Beside him, Theo noticed a red box. Upon opening it, he discovered earrings with a large ruby inside. At that moment, Julie's entered the study. He reported that he had taken care of those lords who stood out during the hunt. Noticing the master's intense gaze, the counselor asked if something was wrong. But the Northern Archduke replied that he didn't even doubt that someone so kind and attentive would have done things as they should be done. Julie's realized that it was all because of the gloves. He suggested to the master that he should also give the girl a gift, and immediately they looked at his mother's earrings. The counselor asked to analyze that decision once more, but Theo replied that the girl wasn't going anywhere, and that those earrings were more valuable and meaningful than simple cloth gloves. Julie knew he wouldn't convince that stubborn guy. The Archduke stood up and decided to give the gift right at that moment. He approached a shelf and ordered his counselor to move away from there, not to stand like a post. Julie smiled, as it seemed as if new life had been breathed into his master. As Theo carried the gift, a radiant smile showed on his face. Approaching Shuna's door, he knocked immediately. The young woman asked for a moment, and Theo waited anxiously, wishing she would finally come out. However, when she did, she froze. Yuna was wearing a very revealing outfit. Seeing that girl, the Archduke's skin instantly prickled, and he didn't understand what kind of magic this was. The girl immediately started covering herself with her hands, believing she was facing the maid. Theo said that from now on, he only wanted to see her in that nightgown, although he only thought it, and didn't say it out loud. Theo explained that he had come to return something, but since it made her uncomfortable, he promised to return later. But Yuna grabbed his arm and asked him to stay. She told him it wasn't uncomfortable for her. The man understood that it must be a terrible spell controlling her physical reactions. In that room, everything belonged to Yuna, and Theo told her she could take whatever she wanted. In that robe, she looked like cotton candy. Theo handed her a small box. The protagonist's face lit up with surprise upon opening it and seeing its contents. The girl, slightly confused, asked the Northern Archduke if he was truly giving it to her. And the man, blushing, nodded. But Yuna didn't know what to wish for. She was truly happy with the gift. Once Yuna thanked the man, a warm smile appeared on the protagonist's face upon seeing her happy expression. He was happy that she liked it. The protagonist thought in surprise. If they kept getting closer like this, one day they could become a normal couple and live happily. Yuna wished for it to happen soon. A week later, they were having lunch together. The protagonist's personal maid, named Ray, sighed deeply. At age 12, She participated in the war instead of her sick older brother to defend the country. And the honor of her family. The other knights used to mock her, but the Archduke personally trained her in swordsmanship. As a result, Rei helped the man win the war, and for that, she was even named an honorary knight of the Great Empire. However, Rei sadly realized that the master was incapable of feeling happy. Rei decided to leave her career and follow him to the castle. She planned to dedicate her life to serving her family, but His Highness had already lost 3 wives. So she started to worry. However, the new lady had a very kind heart. With a woman like that by his side, the man would be able to find happiness. Rei thought so, but she was furious, because today the Northern Archduke seemed annoyed. Yuna was delighted with the beautiful garden. She asked the man what his favorite flowers were, but the man replied emotionlessly, saying that he didn't like flowers at all, which made Rei even angrier. Yuna suggested having tea, but Theo indicated that they would have it brought to his study. Sadness immediately appeared on the young woman's face. The counselor carefully observed the Archduchess, and noticing she wasn't wearing earrings, deduced that the Lord was upset about it. He whispered an idea into Rei's ear. The young woman proposed shock therapy, but the counselor replied that they first needed to get His Highness away. Rei quickly invented a false excuse to ask the Lord to leave for a moment. Theo stood up and told Yuna he would step away for a moment. Ulis approached the young woman and asked permission to ask a bold question. The protagonist, of course, agreed. And then the counselor asked if His Highness had given her anything valuable the day before. She nodded, and the man explained that those were the earrings worn by the late Archduchess. Now the jewels remained as a memory of his mother. It was very valuable to the Archduke. The protagonist understood her biggest mistake and asked the counselor what to do in such a delicate situation. She actually had a reason. Rei was following her master. Theo asked the maid if she was perhaps thinking of betraying him, as everything was reflected in her face. He asked Arata why she was being so distant with the lady. Did she not like him somehow? But the black-haired man instantly replied that it wasn't about that. And probably he was the one the Archduchess didn't like. But few are attracted to cold people. Theo asked if the lady had ever mentioned those earrings. Rei asked the master if he was referring now to those ruby earrings that belonged to his deceased mother. Now she understood the reason for the master's bad mood, but it wasn't worth getting angry about. Rei deduced that the lady was saving the valuable ornament for a special occasion, so the master should apologize. Unexpectedly, Yuna caught up with them. Struggling to catch her breath, she said she needed to say something. Yuna handed over the box and explained that they had clarified it for her and that those earrings were actually a memento of her late mother. She couldn't accept them now. Theo was not surprised that such a gift moved her. It was enough that she had accepted them at first, so he apologized for causing some trouble. But he still asked Yuna to keep them. But the protagonist exclaimed that she couldn't wear them. The dark-haired man tensed up when the young woman suddenly approached him and looked at him with determination. She explained that she simply didn't have pierced ears. It turned out that Yuna had a small mark on her earlobe. To wear these accessories, the protagonist needed to pierce her ears. But she couldn't do it alone. But she couldn't wait to wear them. So she asked her husband, in a pleading tone, to help her. The Northern Archduke asked again if she was sure, and the girl nodded, as she had always wanted to wear earrings. Her father left a mark on her here, similar to a piercing. But it was actually a red mark on the saint's body. The protagonist enthusiastically informed him that she specifically requested him because she truly trusted him. He touched her chin and announced that he was starting. Theo was so close that it made Yuna blush. It should hurt a little, but the hero promised to do it as quickly as possible, and Yuna just had to bear it for a little while. He brought the needle close to her ear. The protagonist closed her eyes tightly as she felt pain. Blood started to flow, and Theo immediately stopped, asking the young woman with concern if she was okay. He suddenly stood up, determined to call the doctor anyway. But Yuna, with a smile on her face, remembered that the other ear still needed piercing. So she could try to do it herself. However, Theo decided to do it himself. After a while, everything was ready. The protagonist put on the earrings and asked His Holiness for his opinion, to which he replied fascinatedly that it was very beautiful. Suddenly, his eyes opened. He immediately remembered his mother. He also remembered that intense emotion he felt then. But that was a long time ago. Ignoring the heavy snowfall, he tried to shout for Mom. But Mom lay unconscious in the midst of endless whiteness. A little earlier, Karen Rose had promised her son she would return soon. So the defense of their lands temporarily passed into his hands. She was more of a knight than a ruler. But during a mission, she died serving the Empire. This great woman dedicated her entire conscious life to the conquest of the North and ultimately gave her life for the duchy. Theo had to ensure her death was not in vain. To protect her legacy, he had to become stronger. Time passed, and at some point, the only memories that Karen Rose ever lived here were a pair of ruby earrings. Theo never paid importance to them, but now he felt sadness, but it disappeared instantly upon seeing the new mistress. The man wanted to confess to Yuna that he was very happy she was his wife. But he stumbled and only thanked her. In reality, only relatives used that form of his name. That's why she liked it when the Archduke used it too. The man said he had no nicknames and everyone just called him Tio, so she could too. The protagonist, of course, agreed. If Tio had given her a family jewel, that surely meant he already considered her his wife. Before you could blink, affectionate names would also arise, and then they would become Mom and Dad. However, the protagonist knew perfectly well that this was still far off, but the thought made him smile. The next day, Yuna and Ray went out to the garden. Thanks to the magic stones, the ground didn't freeze, so the flowers had to be constantly taken care of. Otherwise, they would be overgrown with weeds. Yuna commented that the flowers from Rue had a very sweet scent. Maybe someday they could visit that place together. But the protagonist remembered her uncle's advice, who had asked her not to often mention Rue so as not to attract strange attention. Now she could only send letters. Yuna was intrigued if her latest letter had arrived yet. It was a normal greeting and a few sentences about the bravery of His Excellency and that he was the handsomest man in the North. But perhaps she overdid it a bit. Ray thought something was wrong, but Yuna hastily explained that she was distracted. Sometimes, the protagonist regretted that time could not be reversed, but the maid suddenly saw him hidden there among the bushes. It seemed like he was trying to hide. Ray immediately started signaling for the Archduke to hide. The protagonist considered sending another letter to her father, though choosing the words carefully this time. Theo understood that she missed her home. Or perhaps Yuna regretted her decision and now wished to return. He wasn't going to allow it. So Yuna's personal maid was surprised when the man suddenly got up from among the bushes. The protagonist turned around upon hearing the sound. But Rai quickly urged her to ignore him. She suggested showing the lady a beautiful flower. Yuna had barely started to know him by name, when suddenly she was thinking of canceling the marriage. That's what Theo deduced. But he wasn't going to allow it. Now Yuna was his wife. 2 months had already passed since Yuna arrived. She was eating quite well and did not refuse the local cuisine, constantly asking for her compliments to be passed on to the chef. Every day she strolled through the garden. Theo had already decided that she had completely forgot about returning home. That's why he didn't expect the girl to be in such a hurry to leave. It takes a month to reach Rook. Suddenly, the man realized they could rebuild the Rook settlement right in the duchy. They could even resettle Yuna's compatriots there. He remembered that Yuna had married him for the magic crystals. That's why Theo would give her even more crystals. The girl definitely wouldn't leave and would stay by his side for the rest of her life. If the Emperor or the Khan hinder it, he will simply destroy them. Suddenly, a female voice called Theo. The dark-haired man immediately hid the magic crystal behind his back and smiled at Yuna. Over a cup of tea, he asked her if it was difficult for her to climb up. But Yuna replied that there was nothing wrong with it. She just didn't want to distract the man from his important matters. That's why she was willing to sacrifice everything for it. Theo's face instantly blushed. The girl extended her hands and invited him to look. The man immediately focused his attention on the Archduchess's hands, which were quite delicate. White and enormously soft. Juno explained that she had found a plant in the garden and invited him to smell it. Theo agreed to do it. The protagonist immediately noticed the man's lips, which were very close to her hands at that moment. His breath caressed her fingers. Theo mentioned that with this plant, a decoction could be prepared for the sick person. These petals grew in the valley, near Juna's house in Ruxor. That's why he was very happy to find them in the Duke's garden. Dad always collected and prepared them when she had a cold. When Yuna remembered her home, her eyes shone. That's why the man decided to give her many magic crystals tomorrow, and Yuna suddenly asked him if he wouldn't mind her going there. Theo asked her if she was sure, and she clarified that she only needed tools for drying. The protagonist proposed accompanying her. Although Theo was distracted from the princely matters, he liked the idea. He could be away from the duchy for a long time without worry, as Julius would perfectly handle the role of vice president. Theo accepted and told her he would ask the counselor to pack her things. They will travel for at least a month, so they must prepare. But the protagonist only mentioned the city market, which wasn't that far away. So much preparation wasn't necessary. They say many delicacies are sold there. The man stood still upon understanding the girl's words. The next day, Ray explained to the lady that there would be many people at the market. So she shouldn't stray too far from His Highness and must behave carefully. Junna promised she would bring back many delicacies. When everything was ready, Ray handed the lady over to Julie's. The counselor asked His Highness to get into the carriage and immediately explained that the master would appear soon. The girl smiled and thanked Julie's. The man closed the door and looked around, thinking that the Lord should hurry up. The protagonist assumed that Theo had a lot of work today, which is why he was delaying so much at that moment. But at least it was good that they were traveling together. Maybe they could even hold hands. The carriage door burst open, and the Archduke immediately apologized to the young woman for making her wait. In his opinion, Yuna looked more like a rabbit. The man explained that he had almost finished all his business. In reality, today's work was not that intense. But Tia had to maintain the image of someone important in front of his wife. Yuli's announced that they were leaving. Yuna noticed that Tia was different today. His hair was styled, he had just had a haircut, and he was also wearing a tie. Even though he can't stand wearing them. The girl indicated that she needed specific equipment to dry leaves. She also wanted to buy sweets. Suddenly, the carriage hit a small stone. The carriage stopped instantly, and Counselor Julies asked with concern if the marriage was all right. He apologized if the incident had scared them. At that moment, Yuna was already in the man's arms. The dark-haired protagonist's face instantly flushed from being so close to the young woman, and his heart started beating faster. He immediately perceived the sweet scent of flowers. They let her go immediately. However, the dark-haired man's lips slowly began to approach the girl, who did not resist and had already closed her eyes. But Julies interrupted them by loudly asking if they were all right. Theo decided to pretend he hadn't heard anything. He hoped Yuna hadn't heard because her ears were closed, but the girl suddenly offered to answer the counselor. The Archduke announced that they could move on. Now the heroes were sitting together and dared not hold hands. The protagonist decided to take the first step and gently touched his hand, causing him a shiver. Theo's face instantly blushed. The Archduke realized this was his chance. Bravely, the man decided to take Yuna's hand. However, Yuli's informed His Highness that they had arrived, and the heroes instantly separated. Sitting face to face, the girl asked confusedly why the market was empty. Theo replied thoughtfully that he didn't even know. The protagonist pointed to the tea shop and suggested to the Archduke that they go there, to which he agreed without hesitation. Julie assumed it shouldn't take them long. They had to finish in 2 hours. Since the man had closed the entire market to buyers, trade in the city stopped. And now people had to wait. Lord Theo promised they would do their best to hurry. Still, it was comforting to see them happy. The merchant wished his lord and Lady a good day as our heroes left their shop. Now they had picked up everything necessary. Yuna suggested making one more stop. The merchants seemed frightened, but the protagonist expected nothing more from them than fear. It was not in vain that he closed the market to buyers during their visit. Theo didn't want Yuna to realize that everyone was terrified of him. The protagonist pointed to one of the sweet shops and told the man she wanted to try one. They had strawberry, tangerine, and even peach. The girl selling all that was surprised by her great height. Her mother had warned her that if she misbehaved, the Archduke would take her away, and that's why the girl was now scared. Yuna asked the young saleswoman to advise her on what to get. The girl looked at the beautiful woman with astonishment. The girl commented that strawberries are delicious, but she likes tangerines more. And her little brother loves apples. So Yuna asked Tia what options to choose. The man said they would take everything. The protagonist laughed and replied to the Archduke that if they ate all those desserts, dinner certainly wouldn't fit. So they decided to try strawberries and tangerines. The people behind the heroes started whispering upon seeing the Archduke. He killed people alive in pieces, but next to the beautiful Archduchess, he looked more like a completely infatuated young man. The girl handed sweets to the lady. Yuna thanked the little one for helping her choose. The heroine noticed that the saleswoman looked a bit pale, but the girl hastily replied that she just needed to sit down. All this was because of the Archduke. Yuna reported that while she rested, she would look after the shop. The girl promised to return soon. The protagonist couldn't stop smiling, but as soon as the girl ran off, the young woman confessed to the man that she felt a little unwell. Today it was completely deserted, and there was no one in the shops. Now Theo felt guilty. He didn't want Yuna to feel sad, so he signaled his counselor to open the gates immediately. A minute passed, and the market was already full of people. Yuna hoped someone would want to buy fruit. A boy saw the sweet stall and asked his father to buy him fruit. But the man froze upon seeing the Archduke. As soon as the boy ran to the stall, Yuna offered him a taste. The boy's father timidly asked for a peach, and the protagonist immediately handed it over. Thanking for the purchase, Theo wished them bon appetit. At the pace they were going, the day flew by. Everything was going well, except that the protagonist didn't understand why the citizens feared the Archduke. After all, he was very kind. Yuna decided to behave more casually. So she offered strawberries to Theo and asked him to taste. Her hand gently slid towards the man's, and she herself said that this strawberry is truly very delicious. Theo immediately froze. The protagonist was slowly approaching. In the end, the man tasted the sugared strawberries, although he didn't really like them that much. But he did it for Yuna. The protagonist suggested going to the market again on another occasion. Theo was not against the idea. Night fell, and the Archbishop stood by his study window, constantly reviewing the day's events. Yuna was the first to take his hand. She couldn't believe that she was liked by him too. Theo decided to celebrate the first contact of their hands and immediately opened a special wine. Saved for an important moment. Julius entered the study and reported that they had bought everything the merchants couldn't sell before nightfall. The people were very grateful for the Archbishop's initiative. Among the citizens, the rumor even spread that she herself cared about the well-being of the people. Then Julius showed the report about Count Delcane, who had contacted the chief priest of Daphne's temple. Theo began to study the report closely. That seemed suspicious, and Gullies confirmed this suspicion. This meeting took place in the Eye of the Storm. The main temple of the goddess Daphne was located in the exact center of the Eye of the Storm, at the top of a mountain where a vortex has roared since time immemorial. Only chosen priests are allowed access there. Before leaving the temple, he must erase all memories of the time spent there. Delcan contacted a priest for information about the saint. The chief priest affirmed that the Archduchess is the saint. The saint is filled with the goddess's light. She is pure as snow and radiant as the sun, and is recognized by the red mark on her ear. When her essence is revealed, everything around her will become clear, as well as her purpose. His Highness received the mark after the stewardship ceremony, and since then, on Rue Island. The alternation of seasons began. Near the eye of the storm, they found a stone with text in the Ru language. But even Delgan couldn't discover all the details. His Highness also saw no stone when he ran to save his mother. Yuli's reported that, for now, he would contact the inhabitants of Ru. Theo didn't understand why. Of all places, it was precisely the eye of the storm. The Archduke's counselor, climbing the spiral staircase tiredly, asked his younger sister Malin to wait a moment. She stopped and asked if he was tired yet. Yuli's remembered that he had a sedentary job and mountains of paperwork. Malin called him a coward and asked him to tell her about the Archduchess. What kind of person was she? And Yuli's described her as good. And the Archduke cares deeply about her. The man's younger sister heard that just recently they even traveled to the city. And there they had a romantic date. But Yuli's only asked her not to talk nonsense. Then he knocked on her ladyship's door. The Archduke's counselor informed his lady that he had brought a new chambermaid. And the lady immediately allowed him in. Ray carefully combed her hair. The protagonist greeted the new girl. Malin immediately introduced herself to her ladyship and promised to face her responsibilities seriously. Yuna thanked the girl in advance for her work. In reality, Malin was a little angry with her older brother for not telling her that the Archduchess was a real beauty. That was Malin's first day of work. Ray reported that in that case, she would return to her duties at the training ground. Malin suggested continuing with the hair care instead of Ray. She told the lady that she looked irresistible that day, especially her hair, which enchanted like the first snowfall. But Jun had surely heard that before. Then, Malin suggested the lady go out for a walk with the Archduke during the snowfall. There is a belief. If you catch the first snowfall with a loved one, the love will last a long time. It was very beautiful and romantic. A smile appeared on the protagonist's face. She would love to be with the Archduke like a real married couple, and the young woman believed this was perfectly achievable. During the walk, Jun asked how the inhabitants of Phoenix entertained themselves. Perhaps they had festivals or markets there. The Archduke used to travel from the fortress to other duchies for work, and, in reality, Jun would like to visit somewhere with him. Upon hearing this, Malin wished to share her wisdom. She promised to prepare a list of Phoenix festivals and attractions. Jun suggested returning and, on the way, taking a look at the White Tower. The Archduke approached and asked if they were leaving yet. The protagonist was happy to see Theo. She asked him if he had also decided to go for a walk, to which the man, with a slight smile, replied that he wanted to get some air. Moreover, he thought it would be nice to walk together. Theo noticed an unfamiliar girl, and Malin immediately introduced herself. The protagonist apologized to His Highness and explained that they had already decided to go to the White Tower. But it was actually black. Theo explained that when it snows, the tower roof turns white, and the inhabitants take it as a sign that winter is coming. Yuna became interested in when the first snow would fall. She needed to invite him for a walk. However, the man unexpectedly announced that he didn't know, and in fact, he hoped there wouldn't be any snow. He hated snow, and the color white already made him nauseous. Yuna asked dumbfounded if the first snowfall wasn't good, but the Archduke severely replied that there is no good snow in nature, which surprised the girls. Suddenly, Yuna turned around and announced that she was leaving, as white was so repulsive to her. Malin immediately apologized to the Lord. The protagonist was confused, not understanding why Yuna reacted like this now. A little later, Julies asked if he could present a report. Theo authorized him with a stern look. The counselor was sure that his lordship already knew, but the Archduchess hadn't left the tower all day. She asked for her food to be brought to her chambers. The lord harshly asked why she wasn't going out for a walk anymore. In such a situation, the counselor knew that a single inappropriate gesture would cost him his head today. Julies replied that, in a sense, the young woman could be understood. She didn't want to meet Theo, that's why she didn't go out. The man didn't understand the reasons, so Julies asked what color his lordship's hair was. Theo replied that it was white, and the counselor said that snow is also white. Yesterday, the Lord said he couldn't even stand the color of snow, and his lordship thought that this rejection also applied to his hair. The Lord was upset, and Julies added that she acted according to that logic. Everyone said the Archduchess's hair was white as snow. Lord Theo quickly approached his counselor and indignantly asked what all that had to do with it. The hero believed that not only was it white, but it had a warm glow. Julies agreed. However, the only thing that mattered was how she perceived it. He approached the door without haste and announced that he would probably leave. The protagonist couldn't leave things as they were. So with determination, he approached his chair and took his vest. He decided to talk to Yuna urgently. He knocked on the door and asked if she was there. There was no response. So the Archduke explained to the young woman that he needed to tell her something urgent. That's why he wanted to meet to talk. Finally, Yuna opened the door and allowed him in. The man was surprised to see Yuna wrapped in a warm blanket that hid almost her entire body, except for her face. He asked her to sit down, and she agreed. Theo suggested she remove the blanket, but Yuna refused. If the Archduke didn't like her hair because it reminded him of snow, then she clearly shouldn't do it. The man immediately approached and removed the blanket from the girl's head. He explained that he never thought her hair resembled snow. Theo admitted that, in reality, he thinks they are very beautiful. And upon hearing this, the protagonist's eyes lit up with surprise. The Archduke apologized to Yuna for hurting her, but she herself asked for forgiveness for not understanding correctly. The protagonist confessed that he often feels awkward around her, and Yuna wanted to know why. Theo was embarrassed to have forced her to stay in the north. Yuna asked why he hated the snow. The protagonist was shocked to discover that it was because of the snow that the Northern Archduke's beloved mother died. Initially, the Empire had few magic crystals. They were always lacking, so the people of Phoenix suffered from the cold all the time. Then, the Kingdom of Baiao offered that if they explored the Eye of the Storm, they would lift the restrictions on the import of magic crystals. The Eye of the Storm was in the place where the snow vortex always roared. The chances of returning alive from there were minimal. However, Theo's mother, Archduchess Karen Rose, headed directly to the Eye of the Storm to save her people. The man recounted that he barely managed to find her body, because when he arrived, the snow had almost completely covered her. That's why Theo hated the snow, because without it, the man could have arrived in time to save his mother. Yuna replied softly that she felt very sorry. Theo smiled and said that everything was fine. The protagonist stood still and looked at him surprised when he reached out his hand and carefully caressed the pins of her ears. The fact that Yuna was wearing those ornaments gave him comfort. Then Theo stood up and asked the girl to rest. Suddenly, Yuna asked if he had drunk again today, and the Archbishop stopped instantly, frozen in place. The secret was that Yuna constantly watched him through the crack in the door. The protagonist proposed to the man that they drink together. The Archbishop was surprised by the girl's proposal. Theo seemed so sad when telling his story that the protagonist felt a great need to cheer him up. Alcohol boosted morale and gave courage to do things that, otherwise, he would never dare to do. Instantly, images began to surface in Theo's mind. He tried to get rid of them quickly and asked the girl if she had ever drunk. Yuna nodded and said she had drunk sweet wine while sailing on the boat. Tonight, the protagonist definitely wouldn't have minded a bit of courage. So he accepted the girl's proposal. Theo hoped he hadn't taken too long choosing the drink. He noticed his reflection in the window and realized that he was starting to lose shape. So he would definitely train tomorrow. Upon entering the room, the man immediately apologized for the long wait. However, Yuna was already asleep. The girl spent the whole day cleaning the tower. He was not bothered by her sleeping, so he decided to watch her sleep and lay down next to her. Yuna was beautiful even while sleeping. Suddenly, Theo noticed that a strand of hair had gotten into her mouth. It was just a small strand. So the protagonist decided to touch it to remove it, as there was nothing wrong with that. Suddenly, Yuna turned towards him. Now their lips were very close. The protagonist's face instantly blushed from her breath. He was exaggerating a little now. He decided to return immediately, but suddenly, Yuna hugged his leg. No one had provoked him like this since his birth. After some time passed, the protagonist slowly opened her eyes, not fully understanding what was happening. She realized she had fallen asleep for a little while. Then Yuna understood what happened, and her eyes opened. The protagonist started apologizing to Tio, trying to explain that she hadn't realized she had fallen asleep. Tio only replied that everything was in order. He proposed trying the wine. Suddenly, Malin burst into the room and greeted His Highness, instantly failing to notice the Archduke. Only then did she notice the Lord's stern gaze. Malin instantly blushed and apologized. The protagonist was perplexed. She thought very little time had passed, but it turned out it was already morning. Theo stood up and proposed postponing the wine for another occasion. Yuna took the man's hand and proposed in that case, having dinner today. This way they could open the wine, as the protagonist considered it a duty to drink a sip of the alcohol Theo had chosen. Malin apologized once more to the Archduchess, but June simply replied that she didn't need to worry. The protagonist got an idea and asked the personal maid to mention what His Excellency's mother was like. The maid said that Karen Rose was a great woman. His Excellency did everything possible to bring her back home. When he galloped alone straight into the eye of the storm, everything plunged into chaos. And many thought he wouldn't return. Fortunately, the knights managed to find him and bring him back to the castle. However, after that incident, the Lord longed for battle. The protagonist assumed that if Theo had gone through something similar, he would also hate the snow. Now June decided to respond to the man's concern. She appeared in front of him in a beautiful dress. The protagonist became interested in whether she could sit next to the Archduke, and the dark-haired man, of course, agreed. During dinner, Jung recounted how her day went. She cleaned the entire lower level of the tower. Although it wasn't part of her duties, Jung considered it important to mention to the man that her room would be there. The lack of windows made it very cozy there. An image immediately appeared in the man's mind. His face instantly reddened. But he quickly recovered and suddenly realized that Juana was much braver than he had initially thought. Suddenly, the young woman stated that they could hide there from the snow, because now she also hated it. So during the first snowfall, they can hide. So as not to stay in one room, they can walk around the tower. The protagonist asked the man with sadness in her voice if it saddened him when it snowed. She didn't want him to be alone at those times. Moreover, Juana would love to get to know Tio better. A warm smile appeared on the Archduke's face, and he told the young woman that he also greatly wished to know her better. Then, Juana recounted that her mother died young and she grew up with her father. He didn't want to talk about his mother. Every time the protagonist wanted to know something about her mom, she would light a bonfire on the seashore. In front of him, her dad became more talkative. When winter comes, Tio proposed lighting a bonfire too. He poured wine into a glass, and with a warm smile on his face, he explained that it would be easier to be sincere between them that way. Yuna looked at her reflection. If a cold evening found her by the fire with Tio, at that moment she would ask if she could truly be his wife. The Archduke proposed a toast to the arrival of winter. Suddenly, Yuli's burst into the study. Tio wanted to protest, but the counselor reported that they had a guest. He said he had arrived from Rue Island and introduced himself as Azorim, adding that His Highness would definitely know him. Yuna joyfully exclaimed that he was her friend. She asked him to come see her, and Tio replied that now would also be a good time. The protagonist ran, humming a tune to herself. The counselor asked His Highness if he even realized that the Archduchess's friend was a man. Azarim turned around upon hearing Yuna's voice. He was the heir to the Apan tribe on Rue Island. The protagonist ran towards the man and hugged him tightly, to which Azarim hugged the young woman with equal intensity. The man said he had really wanted to see her. Theo stood frozen upon seeing them holding hands. They hugged and held hands so naturally, but the Northern Archduke didn't understand if that was normal. Yuna introduced Theo to her childhood friend. The man's face looked very tense. Azarim confidently approached the Archduke and greeted him respectfully, extending his hand as a sign of friendly intention. Then Azarim introduced himself to Juna's husband. The girl immediately apologized to the Archduke for her friend's lack of manners. Juno explained to Azarim that he was the Archduke of Phoenix, and the man extended his hand again and said it was a pleasure to meet him. Theo didn't want Juna to feel uncomfortable, so he accepted the handshake. However, the man couldn't forgive this man for hugging Juna, so he squeezed Azarim's hand very hard. Juna's friend asked if this man was a bear since he was huge, but they were speaking another language. And Theo, with a forced smile, asked the girl to translate for him. The protagonist angrily asked her childhood friend if he could speak normally and use the common language now. Suddenly, Azarim announced that he was hungry. Theo saw this as an opportunity to show Juna how generous her husband was, and how controlled his lord was, ignoring his friend's familiarity. So he told Azarim that, of course, he would feed him. His wife's close friend could feel right at home. A slight expression of confusion appeared on Azarim's face. As soon as the characters sat at the table, the protagonist asked her friend how things were in the settlement, and if the weather had worsened a lot. Azarim calmed her down by saying there was no reason to worry. The man suddenly asked if the food was finished yet. He pointed to the Archduke with his finger and explained that he meant his empty plate. But the girl asked him not to point his finger. Theo mentally called him an annoying brat. If His Excellency had already eaten, he could leave, since Azarim wanted to talk a lot with his childhood friend. But the Archduke replied irritably that he would stay. He ordered Ulis to bring additional food. The Archduke had no intention of leaving those two alone, so he was going to eat until lunch started coming out on its own. Yuna explained that Theo ate a lot. She told him that she had missed everyone very much during that time. Her friend, with a warm smile, told her that he missed her terribly because Yuna hadn't left his mind for hours. Azarim regretted letting her go at that moment. The Archbishop clenched his fork angrily, and Yuna told him that things were also going well for her here. She already had two friends, Ray and Malin, and His Highness's secretary, Ulis, always ready to help. Besides, Theo treated her very well. Words couldn't describe how grateful Yuna was. Theo replied that it was natural. That's why there was no need to thank him. But if she needed anything, he would take care of it. Azarim commented that he was glad to hear His Highness was kind to Yuna. The Archbishop understood that this visit had a motive. Yuna's friend explained that if it hadn't been for the Lord of the North, the girl would have married him, since a marriage between heirs is natural. Theo replied that in their language, they call it dog talk. That expression was used to describe something nonsensical. Frowning, Yuna angrily asked her childhood friend why he was bringing up that topic at the table right now. She didn't understand what possessed him suddenly. Azarim apologized and clarified that he only wanted to test her. The man explained to his girlfriend in another language that all this was necessary to check her true heart. Yuna wanted to be a good wife to Theo, but the situation was very awkward. Azarim lowered his gaze and apologized. The joke went too far. He thanked him for taking care of Yuna, and the tense Archduke replied that it was part of his duty as a husband. Yuna always said she liked confident men. It was quite late, so Theo proposed ending dinner. Azarim told his girlfriend that he already missed the days when they talked about everything nonstop. But Theo informed him that the guest rooms were in another location. Yuna's friend was about to say he would stay with her, but the Lord forbade it instantly. The protagonist suggested her friend talk tomorrow. Theo only became more irritated with the whole situation. After a while, he forcefully placed the most expensive bottle of alcohol he had on the table. The man already hated that bastard. He feared imagining that Yuna would take offense and return home. Suddenly, the arch-brother of Phoenix heard a sound, as if someone had thrown a small stone at the window. And he became alert. It turned out to be Yuna, who greeted him with a wave. It turned out she had forgotten to return something. It was a tea made with jazz leaves. Theo was surprised that Yuna had gone for something like that, and the girl replied that she wanted him to try the tea first. Yuna thanked the man for being kind to Azarim that day. The archbrother smiled and promised to try the tea. At dawn, Azarim was walking down the hallway. He stopped upon hearing a voice from behind ordering him to stop. The archbrother, with a cold gaze capable of terrifying even the bravest, asked Azarim where he was going at such an hour. The man asserted that he did not allow being called by his name, so Azarim showed his true face. The archbrother repeated his question, and Azarim immediately replied that he could not sleep. That is why he wanted to see Yuna right now. Tio coldly asked when he would return home. Azarim replied naturally that he initially only planned to meet Yuna, and then leave the continent immediately. However, now I understand that I must stay longer. The Archduke remembered that the heir should not be absent from his lands for so long. But Azarim said he became the heir specifically because he wanted to marry Jun. It hurt him that his beloved had to marry someone like the Archduke of the North, who always sought to control everything by force. Azarim was furious because it was Theo who proposed magic stones in exchange for a wife. The Archduke smiled and recalled that they had accepted each other. But the dark-haired man rejected him from the start, and Delkin always seemed like a suspicious guy to him. But in the end, Azarim himself let Jun leave home. So now he didn't have to complain anymore. Azarim concluded that the Archduke only uses his need and desperation as an excuse. That's why he keeps Jun here. Now the dark-haired man understood why the main requirement was marriage. But the Archduke asserted that he would let him leave alive only for her sake. Azarim exclaimed that they would meet in the training arena tomorrow, and that Jun must not know under any circumstances. In the village, Sarim was popular among the girls. The protagonist asked Malin if His Highness looked like a real aristocrat. The personal maid was perplexed by such a question. Yuna enthusiastically said that His Highness was so stylish and had attractive facial features. And aristocratic. But Malin knew the Archduke from another perspective. Suddenly, she became interested in where Rai was, and Yuna replied that she was a little late today. They say a very important event will happen in the training arena today. That's why she was there now. The knights surrounded Azarim and started asking him questions. The man told them stories about how he took down a bear with a knife. Azarim added that he spoke with the maids today, who, it turns out, are very interested in knights. He promised to introduce them if they wished. The Archduke coldly asked why they weren't training. Azarim informed the master that he was late and admitted that he had already started thinking that he wouldn't come today at all. Without further words, Tio threw a wooden sword at his opponent. He asked Azarim to be thankful that the sword was not real. The knights immediately started murmuring, as His Highness hadn't faced a duel in a long time. But this guy seemed self-assured. Azarim took a fighting stance and asked his opponent why he was scared. But Tio calmly replied that he was simply thinking about how to defeat him, without at least becoming lame after the fight. Shatton tightly gripped the handle of his sword, as those words angered him. He decided to observe how the Archduke would speak now, and went straight for the attack, sure of his strength. But Tio managed to dodge him with ease. Then Azarim landed another blow, which was blocked. The Archduke's eyes widened the instant his opponent, with an arrogant smile, told him that Jun would not be happy here. Such a cruel person could not be by her side. Those words made Theo relax his guard, and Azarim managed to hit him in the side. The man considered keeping Jun in such a cold place simply cruel. But the Archduke calmly asked his rival if he had finished talking yet, or if he had anything else to say. Theo proposed finishing quickly, giving Châtain a few hits and letting him go. Then he started the attack. He said 3 hits would be enough. An instant later, Azarim fell to the ground with a crash. He was stunned when the wooden sword broke in his hands, which meant the duel was over. And he had lost. The Archduke said that was enough. As Azarim suspected, this man possesses unimaginable power. He wanted His Excellency to extend his hand. But Tio simply looked away indifferently, showing his total disinterest. Azarim stood up and announced that he would go to Juno. Seeing the Archbishop's disapproving look, the dark-haired man asked if he would perhaps forbid him. Julian burst into the study and asked Tio with concern if he was all right. The counselor was informed that the master had been in the training arena, and his opponent got what he deserved. Julian was alarmed to see blood on his master's hand, but the archbishop calmly asked him to calm down. Azarin was not bad, and that wasn't just bragging. He is fast and knows how to destabilize his opponent. The archbishop intentionally allowed him to touch him a couple of times before definitively snatching the weapon away. Juno was too easy for Tio, so that dark-haired man deserved a consolation prize. Azarin's words went through the dark-haired man's mind. All those complaints were empty, but he wouldn't let her go anyway. If the dark-haired man wanted to see his beloved, he could go and look all he wanted. Azarim stood frozen, realizing that the archbishop was truly crazy. Tio sat in his study reading a document. He frowned immediately from a sharp pain that suddenly attacked his left hand, as if a sharp knife were piercing it. Maybe he really shouldn't have held back and just driven out all the bad from him. Azarim burst into the study and exclaimed that because of him, he couldn't see Yunj. But Tio simply reminded him of the basic rules of etiquette. He chuckled and pushed him aside, wondering if he was angry about a simple punishment. Although he knew that wasn't it. The prince explained that their rooms were connected by a bridge. That's why Azarim would have to deal with him every time. The blonde man, his face distorted by disapproval, angrily exclaimed that he had suspected from the beginning that he had locked her in the tower. Yunyi suddenly entered the study. She was surprised to see Azarima there. The protagonist told the prince that something terrible had happened, and the staircase to her room had completely collapsed. But Theo reassured her by saying that it was all the workers' fault. The collapse happened while Yunyi was cleaning downstairs. The prince asked her not to even consider that Yunyi was at fault, since it took him a long time to check the tower's condition more closely. However, the danger had already passed. Yuna asked her friend what they had talked about with the Archduke. She already knew that they would find a way to understand each other between the two of them. One night was enough for them to become friends. Azarim was surprised when the master confirmed these words. Yuna apologized for interrupting the conversation and announced that she was leaving. When the Archduke asked, confused, where she was going, the protagonist replied that today she planned to tend the garden with Malin. Although the servants could take care of it, Yuna liked doing it. Suddenly, Azarim offered to help. Upon hearing this, the Archduke confidently asserted that he would also join them. He sketched a smile and commented to the dark-haired man that he wouldn't mind a little exercise either. Malin suggested a place to plant flowers to the lady. The protagonist asked the two young men if a small table for tea would fit in that place. They both supported her at the same time. But then they looked at each other with a murderous expression. Ray joined them and apologized to His Highness for being so delayed in the training arena. Yuna complimented the girl, as that outfit looked great on her. Ray remembered that the lady had asked for help with something. Suddenly, she saw the Archbishop pulling out weeds and was surprised to see such an unexpected scene. Yuna recounted that Theo and Azarim offered to help her. Ray looked at the outsider, who was really good at combat. She was furious that he dared to hurt the master of the castle. Moreover, she couldn't stand braggarts. Shaitan stood up instantly upon seeing Ray. He saw her in the training arena and was impressed. The young woman's cheeks instantly flushed from the unexpected compliment from the conceited outsider. Malin playfully asked her to stop standing still like a statue. She picked up the axe, but Yuna stopped her and reminded her that there were two young men who could take care of that. The protagonist immediately addressed the men, pointed to the stumps, and asked them to pull them out. It was necessary to prepare the ground for new plantings, so the men instantly agreed to help with that. Tio picked up the axe, but instantly his hands started to hurt. Azarin asked if he was having difficulty already. The Archduke suggested the dark-haired man try, and the man replied that in Ruge he had felled at least 100 trees. He lunged, but immediately felt pain in his left side. In the end, the axe only grazed the stump. Ray approached him and skeptically said that she would do better. With a clear and confident move, full of strength, the young woman easily split the thick stump in two. Yuna marveled at Ray's strength. The girl suggested His Highness leave the matter, but Theo decided to fix it himself. He had to surpass the dark-haired man at all costs, so the stump had to split right before Yuna's eyes. Even so, he managed to split the stump a little. Theo immediately entered standby mode, waiting for Yuna to praise him. But instead, the young woman approached the man and said with concern that his face was pale and cold hands. Yuna told the maids that they would finish later. The protagonist suggested Theo go lie down and rest. A slight blush appeared on the Archduke's face, and although he liked this concern, Yuna shouldn't worry. Unexpectedly, Azarim proposed a joint walk to the young woman. Theo also planned to join, but the protagonist asked him to rest. Yuna promised they would take a short walk, and Azarim added that His Highness needed to rest properly. Theo immediately took the protagonist's hand. With a complaining voice, he said he felt terribly unwell. The Archduke asked her to hurry, as he wanted Yuna to personally prepare his special herbal tea for him. The protagonist promised she would be back soon. Then she left with her friend for a walk. Theo immediately called Ray. The Lord ordered them to be followed, as he wanted to know everything they talked about, and the young woman wasn't even surprised. It's hard to believe that Azarim arrived here with a friendly visit. That's why Theo wondered what plans that dark-haired man had. Everything here flourished despite the cold, and Yuna asked her childhood friend if he considered it amazing. But all this was thanks to the magic stones. Gunna explained that even the river water freezes in winter. Azarim immediately noticed several spies watching them at that moment and suspected who was behind it. He apologized for the delay and explained that he was just admiring the view of the place. Yuna acknowledged that these outdoor walks brought her peace. Azarim remembered well that since he was very young, when they were both still children and without worries, Yuna loved walking. Their walks together meant a lot to him, but with the arrival of winter, they had to leave them behind. Azarim repeatedly reminded himself that it was the only way to save the island, although he remained angry. Suddenly, they arrived at a cottage. Shat proposed going inside and talking without annoying witnesses. The protagonist wondered if they hadn't been alone the whole time. Azarim suggested using the Ru language, since there was no one else nearby now, and Yuna gladly accepted. Shaitan told the girl that Zuma won the tournament. It hurt him not to have been able to attend the tournament in person. Then he started imitating his father, who had to help instead of going. Yuna asked how her dad was doing now. Azarim told her that since she left, he almost never leaves home. The protagonist asked her friend to tell him that she is fine as soon as he returns to Rook Island. But Azarim refused, saying she would tell him herself. But Delkin told Yuna that they must wait at least an hour, so it wouldn't look like a trap to obtain the magic stones. Shaitan told him he didn't need to be there anymore. He found another way. Gullies knocked on the door of his master's study and announced his arrival. The Archduke, completely naked to the waist, immediately turned to the counselor, asking where Yuna was at that moment. Yulis was surprised that the wound had healed so quickly. Tief frowned upon learning that the girl had returned a long time ago. The counselor confessed that he had personally asked for the lady to enter later, thinking that His Highness had already been asleep for a long time. The Archduke asked if there was any news from the shadows. Yulis recounted that they talked a little about the news from the island and then entered the master's cottage. Tio asked Erato what they went there to do. The counselor explained, perplexed, that they had simply gotten cold. In the cottage, they talked at length about something, carrying the entire dialogue in the Rux language. That's why the topic is not known. The shadows said that Azarim was clearly trying to convince the girl of something. The protagonist lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. A voice from her childhood sounded in her mind, saying that he had found another way for her to return home. He asked her to remember the snow woman from the island myths. Her hair was white as snow. There was a myth. If the snow woman drank the water from the river of memories, she could regain her true power and save the island from danger. On the island, many believed that Yuna resembled that woman. However, the protagonist remembered that no one knew the location of the river. but Azarim managed to find it. The source of sacred water in a specific temple greatly resembled the river of memories, emitting a blue glow. Yuna asked surprised how he came up with that. He heard it in the comments of the natives. Although they couldn't fully trust it, the man saw no other way to save the island. And he didn't want Yuna to be devalued. The heroine would like to help her people. That's why she promised him that she would ask Tio to let her go to that temple. A smile formed on Azarim's face, and he thanked Yuna for supporting his idea without hesitation. But the man asked not to tell a foreigner about Ru's traditions. It would be great if Azarim was right. Then the island would be saved from the cold, and everything would be perfect. Dad could regain his strength, and the protagonist could live happily with Tio. If there is no deal, they could be a normal couple. The girl sank into her dreams. But suddenly, she remembered the promise to the Archduke that she had promised to keep in the morning. And she ran to him immediately. It was already late, and Theo might have fallen asleep. But since Yuna had made a promise, she had to keep it. The protagonist quickly decided to prepare an aromatic tea and retire to her room. Upon opening the door, she immediately bumped into someone. It turned out to be Theo, who hadn't fallen asleep yet. Yuna didn't expect him to have waited for her the whole time and immediately apologized, explaining that she had simply lost track of time. She hoped he wasn't angry now.